no one is going to argue, or at least I'm not going to argue, that slavery was justified and good. I think no one's trying to make an argument. I am certainly not doing an argument. But it ended, and it was ended in the UK. So the compensation for morality is tricky because you have to have some kind of damage and calculate other things and so on and so on. If it is a purely moral argument, then yeah, I agree. Slavery is bad. That's true. But the question isn't about morality, it's about cost and compensations or economic arguments.
I am very delighted to be joined by Rasheed Griffith. Rasheed is the executive director of the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute, and he's also program lead in the Emergent Ventures Africa Caribbean section of the Mercatus Institute, Mercatus Center at George Mason University. So thank you firstly for joining me.
Thank you so much.
And so the reason we're having this conversation is that Rasheed and I met very recently, and one of the things that we were discussing was the reparations conversation, which has essentially become more and more significant in the public debate about all sorts of race-related issues, whether that's the British Empire, the slave trade, its historical legacy, why certain countries that were formerly colonies are not necessarily as economically developed as perhaps other countries that weren't, and so on and so forth. Many people that listen to this podcast will be very familiar with this discussion. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to Rasheed is that he has a very critical and interesting perspective when it comes to reparations, being somebody from the Caribbean himself. And oftentimes when we hear about this discussion, we never hear any other voices other than those that are very passionate about Britain giving reparations. And very recently, the Barbados PM said that Britain essentially owed $4.9 trillion for reparations. So I guess firstly, Rasheed, could you just give us a little bit of background about yourself? And you wrote a very good article on reparations that we're going to link into the description for this podcast. But if you could give us a bit of a background about yourself and why you thought it necessary and important to push back in this reparations discussion.
Sure, I could do that. So I'm from Barbados, born and raised, and then I lived for a few years in Asia and Europe, and now live in Europe. And I have working in financial sectors and public policy for some time, mostly in Washington. And I've grown up with this commentary on reparations as being the obvious thing that is correct, particularly reparations for the Caribbean from the UK. That's the mode I'm familiar with it. But then over time, and from a young age, I've been skeptical of that argument, but never in a very concrete way. As I got older, I became even more skeptical, but also in a more concrete way. And I realized in the last 2 years in particular, the argument has gotten to a point where it's not some obscure academic consideration or some obscure, activist, meeting where you have a coffee and some chats about reparations. It's now forefront political policy. And it's got to a point where not only is reparation argument, in my view, on the merits not appropriate, even procedural grounds is not appropriate, but also it kind of allows Caribbean countries to essentially absolve themselves of the actual work they need to do to progress the Caribbean forward. And I think that has been the most dramatic change, where not only reparations is essentially bad for the arguments they make, is that when you make those arguments, it absolves themselves of doing actual governance. So therefore, it only harms people even further who currently live in the Caribbean. So I kind of got a lot frustrated with that kind of conversation. And recently, I formed a new think tank to kind of discuss the role of economic growth and economic progress in the Caribbean. And so this argument kind of fits into that kind of conversation.
So before we get into the kind of specifics of the reparations discussion and whether it's appropriate, right or wrong, why do you think that it has become so much more in the public debate over the last couple of years?
Mm. I definitely think this is a American intervention in the sense that because of the Black Lives Matter activist movement in the US, just that kind of force globally has attracted some attention, and the Caribbean has pushed forward a lot as well. Caribbean governments have been essentially propagating this idea for many times, most forcefully in the last decade. But when the Black Lives Matter movement in the US 3 years ago kind of really got into the conversation, this part of the Black Lives Matter, but not from the US personally, but from the Caribbean, became to get a lot more traction. So the Caribbean governments kind of pushed even further with that conversation internationally in the US, in Europe, in the UN, and of course in the UK. So those kind of factors kind of coalesced together at the same time, really made it to a very important or impactful conversation now. And at the same time, you're seeing a lot more academics writing books and papers and edited volumes calling for reparations. So again, all these things really coalesce together in the last 3 years.
And just one more question on that point. Why do you think reparations is much more of a conversation in the Caribbean than, for
Mm.
example, in Africa or even Asia?
In my view, it's actually a very Caribbean conversation in the sense that the intellectual backing for it very much started a Caribbean creation. And that's a bit of a big statement to make. But even, for example, one of the most important scholars that started this movement of thinking about what Britain did to the Caribbean was good for Britain, therefore the Caribbean should have some kind of benefit, was Eric Williams, who is a Caribbean scholar educated in Oxford, but also former Prime Minister of Trinidad. At the same time, or not the same time, but a little later, you have also Walter Rodney, who is a very important figure in this conversation as well. With his book "How Europe Underdeveloped Africa," that's a very big, important book in this conversation. He's from the Caribbean. You also have obviously whole idea of Pan Africanism, which in many ways was kind of a Caribbean American creation, not African creation. Marcus Garvey, for example. So a lot of it centers on the Caribbean intellectual thought. And then, of course, you could bring in, for example, Fanon, which is world famous for kind of um, black scholarship, black academia, who's also from the Caribbean as well. So a lot of the intellectual backing for the reparations argument stems from Caribbean intellectuals.
And so, in terms of your argument, because there are different arguments, there's the economic argument, there's the practical argument, and then there's the moral argument. So the moral argument
Mm.
is, um, against it is that essentially that it could be instituting a kind of idea that that Caribbean people are incapable of developing themselves without some kind of financial support from non-Caribbean countries. There's the kind of work practicality. Is what about mixed race people? There's all these different. How would it practically be implemented? Who would receive it and in what way? And then there's the economic argument as well that it just wouldn't provide the kinds of things that people are hoping for. So is your and also that it's just wrong, that that's not how you should develop
Mm-hmm.
economically. So is your argument is primarily economic, but do you also factor in the other arguments? That is it a moral and practical argument for you, or is it fundamentally an economic one? Why you don't agree with it?
So in many ways, these are all interrelated. So the moral argument stems often from the fact that there is an economic argument. And the practical argument also stems from the fact that there is an economic argument. So for example, you have the moral argument saying, usually, this is how people phrase it, is that Britain so much exploited mostly the Caribbean, that therefore they should actually try to recompense and provide some kind of reparatory justice for this inhumane treatment that benefited England. So the argument isn't that the let's say slave period was bad and therefore also bad for England. It is bad. The argument is bad for the Caribbean people, but because England benefited so much economically, therefore you should offer some kind of payment to kind of assuage the damages and compensation. So the economic argument is important for the moral argument as well. So the moral argument to me, in many ways, breaks down very quickly because, of course, whose is the on the hook for the moral blame? Because obviously there's a factor of moral blame to consider. And if you're going to say, well, the current British population on the hook for moral blame, that's a non-starter. And they're also going to say, well, the current Caribbean population is therefore on the hook for moral compensation. Again, it seems that that's also a non-starter. But again, that's not how it's phrased. But when you kind of go down that line, I think that comes to conclusion quite quickly. So therefore, they push back to the economic argument that because British, usually they frame it as British Industrial Revolution, because British industrialization happened because of Caribbean exploitation, that is why now still current Britain should pay some kind of compensation to current Caribbean. And that's now also going into the practicality argument, whereas is it even practical in any consideration? To me, the practicality argument is also a very strong one against, of course, paying reparations. We could get into that. But to me, it still always rests on is it economically viable to do it? And if it is, maybe we can still figure out the practicalities. That's the how that kind of goes. It doesn't matter how hard it is if it's still viable to do. But then when it goes back to economic argument, it's actually not based on any kind of reality. So therefore, the practicality argument, we shouldn't even get there because you can't have the conversation unless it is true there is some economic benefit that England achieved by the simple reason of exploiting the Caribbean.
And so lay out for us what you think the economic argument um, against reparation is. Because and obviously it'll be useful to understand what people think the economic benefit for
Mm-hmm.
reparations are as well, and why you think that argument is just not sufficient.
So I'll do that one first. So a typical argument goes like this: Britain, and obviously I'm going to use Britain all the time here, but people extend towards France and Spain as well, but Britain for this conversation. So Britain had the slave trade of enslaved Africans, primarily from, West Coast to the Caribbean, and then somewhat into America as well, and then also to the UK. But the Caribbean was by far the bulk of where the enslaved people were kept. Now, because of the labor of the enslaved population in the Caribbean, primarily producing sugar, and the sugar plantations were owned primarily by British landlords, that industry provided a key basis for causing, and oftentimes you will see they don't use the word cause or use some other word, but it still boils down to them saying cause, to causing the British industrialization. Oftentimes, I would say was a key factor, was a necessary criteria, so on and so on, but it has to be a cause factor, causing the British industrialization, and therefore, without the Caribbean, or to go further, without exploiting of enslaved labor in the Caribbean, British industrialization could not have happened, and the wealth of England could not have become where it is today. So therefore, because of the exploitation before 300 years ago, 200 years ago, Britain now, because it is rich because of the industrialization process, should again compensate the Caribbean countries who were the victims of the exploitation 300 years ago to get Britain where it is now. That is the structure of the common argument in favor of why Britain should give reparations to the Caribbean. Now, on the surface, I see why it's actually persuasive because it sounds correct. The structure makes sense, but it breaks down when you kind of look at the details. So, a key part of the argument is the enslaved labor producing sugar was a key factor in British industrialization. So you can test that by just looking back at history. That's the, I guess, fun thing with econ history. So therefore, the income from slavery produced sugar should have been a substantial part of the UK's national income in that period. Of course, therefore, that income can then be deployed in theory to build factories and things like that. But when you look at the data, the the income from sugar was just around 2% of total British national income. It's actually not that big. And it's actually not even much bigger than other, like copper, for example, other industries like that. So therefore, should you also argue, therefore, that the copper industry, primarily from Ireland at the time, also produced the industrial revolution? You kind of get these weird arguments going forward like that. Another factor, however, is that the idea of industrialization is always linked in the pro reparations arguments to capital accumulation. That is, it is because you have more money, therefore you're industrialized. Of course, that's not really true. That's not true at all, because the idea of industrialization is with harnessing technology, and the technological change that happened around that time that allowed to spur the industrialization. Because if you just pure money, Britain had the most money in that time period. France was a better economy in some ways, Portugal as well, but they didn't have the industrialization process because they didn't have the other things that are more important: the skills, the technology, the different logical changes, so on and so on. So it breaks down in econ history the accumulation factor, the contribution factor to the British economy. So it kind of breaks on there. Now, there is another aspect of it as well, where it says, okay, well, the slave trade system was also a big factor in the accumulation aspect of money. The problem there, again, is that France and Portugal and Spain also had slave systems, and they were actually producing even more commodities at better margins than the British system. So if that was a key factor, you should have also seen, or should have seen instead, France, for example, or even Portugal, have this rapid industrialization process that we call the British industrialization. You did not see that happen. So it cannot be the system that we attributed, we meaning reparations pro people. We can't attribute this thing to that particular aspect of the slave system. So it breaks down quite quickly. But again, you don't really see that kind of conversation happening when they argue. Because when you read the arguments they make, they never factor in anything besides stating their case. There are no counterfactuals, there is no comparable examples, nothing. It's just, this is truth. And actually, if you read the books, for example, by Hilary Beckles, who's a main advocate from the Caribbean for reparations, he would actually state in the book, the people who disagree with him are racist. That's literally the kind of, well, I say essentially the argument he's making in the book as well. So there's no room for conversation in many ways.
No, that's really helpful how you laid that out. And I think that's really, and the lack of nuance and the lack of kind of concrete evidence that is provided, I think is really important. I mean, what do you say to those who just say, look, regardless of what directly contributed to Britain's economic development, during that period, slavery and colonialism were wicked practices, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore, if Britain is to atone for its moral wrongdoing for hundreds of years, reparations is one of those. If they are serious about no longer being a imperialist colonialist power, that argument, this is a way to demonstrate that. Or so,
Mm-hmm.
irrespective of whether it directly contributed, slavery and colonialism during that period directly contributed to Britain's economic prosperity, comparatively to others, it is the right thing to do.
I find that argument even weaker because that is easier to understand why it's wrong. Yes, Britain, a British Empire, was devilishly racist in the early aspects of it, of the empire stages. It was, there's no word you can use to describe how bad it was in that sense. However, things changed, and things changed long before the colonial period ended. So, Britain spent a substantial amount of money, almost all of the Navy budget in some aspects, to prevent other empires from continuing slavery when it decided that slavery was there for the end. And that's it, slave trading. All of that money spent to prevent France and Spain and Portugal from continuing slavery, stopping slave ships from leaving the coast of Africa and so on. That is a strong action of recompense, right? The road to Damascus already started, long before that time colonial period ended. So it was not just that they decided to end and therefore let's leave bygones to the end and let's move on. No, Britain spent a substantial amount of manpower, time, money, resources, all the things to continue this effort to prevent this system from happening in other places. Also, the colonial or colonies at the time, after emancipation, long after emancipation, for example, many of them, especially Caribbean, saw a lot of benefit from the technical talent that the British administration were to provide in the colonies at the time. Of this now, obviously, this is I find for some reason this is a more controversial point in many cases, but you can in the Caribbean, it's a very good example of how it works out. So you have places like Barbados, where I'm from, or you have like Jamaica, you have other Caribbean countries that are they're many of them are British colonies, but they perform a lot differently than each other. So Barbados, for example, even again, this is the 30s and 20s now, had much higher literacy rates than Jamaica. They had better health outcomes than Jamaica. So when in Jamaica you hear reparations people saying, and actually there's a book edited by Caroline Elkins, who's famous for the book The Legacy of Violence of the British Empire. She has a volume that she co-edited called Time for Reparations. In that book, you have a chapter arguing for why Jamaica should get reparations. And what's funny is that the author made the point of the literacy rate in Jamaica is kind of low because of colonialism. But Barbados is also a colony in the same region for as long as Jamaica, and we have essentially 100% literacy rates. And our rates being checked through time has actually always been higher than Jamaica. So the factor of colonialism can't be the reason why Jamaica's rates were lower, because it gets more complex. Because the governance of Barbados and the governance of Jamaica was done differently even during the colonial period. And that's the kind of lack of nuance that comes up a lot because they don't tend to look under the black box. I guess they pretend it is a black box, but it's not a black box. You can peer into it and see that institutions that were developed in the colony actually vary a lot. It's not just colonial administration across the board. So, for
What
example,
was it? Yeah, just on that.
oh,
How was it different with Jamaica?
mhm. Sure. So we could use Jamaica and Barbados again. So in Jamaica, the kind of plantation system was not the same kind of plantation system as Barbados. So, for example, the owners of the plantation in Jamaica never tend to live in Jamaica. They always had managers who lived on the island, and they themselves lived outside. Where in Barbados, a lot of the plantation owners just live in Barbados itself, and the properties from which they were to design legislation in Jamaica was a lot more, let's say, self-centered than developmental, where in Barbados was different in that sense. And because Jamaica had a lot more enslaved people in the country, different things happened. So they had more revolts. They had more, I was like, maroon colonies in the mountains. where in Barbados it's so tiny, so you can't go anywhere. You're kind of everything kind of really zeroed out. So Jamaica had, like, for example, a lot of different violent episodes where Barbados never did. So Jamaica even had its charter revoked a few times and come under direct rule from the UK throughout its time period, wherein Barbados was completely, for the entire period called colonial period, was self-governing in many ways. So uninterrupted for the entire 300 and some years, where Jamaica had periods of interruption because the underground administration couldn't get things passed, couldn't get things figured out. So they were actually very different places in many ways. So because of this, you can't just say colonialism caused X, because even in the Caribbean, not too far apart, different things happen in different ways during the same period. But again, they don't bring they don't bring these points into the conversation. Now, to kind of go back to your original question here, the colonial management system was actually a good benefit for small countries. So in Barbados, you can do some estimates and show that the bulk of growth of Barbados, even considering now, came during the 50s and early 60s. That was the bulk of it. That was still under a colonial period. Barbados became independent in 1966, similar to other Caribbean countries. And since then, it's kind of been deteriorating over time. You can also look at some current overseas dependencies of the UK. They are in the Caribbean, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, BVI. In general, they outperform the independent Caribbean countries. Now, the problem here is if it is that colonialism is bad for the country, but the current, in all but name, colonies in the Caribbean outperform the independent countries, there is some discrepancy in the conversation. So I'm not saying it proves or disproves any argument, but it kind of makes the argument a bit more difficult to conclude without really bringing in these other parts of the conversation. So simply saying that the UK just was, bad for the colonial administration or bad for all these things, or for example, I mentioned earlier that slavery happened, therefore it's enough, but they've actually spent a lot of money already trying to prevent these empires from ending to push the other empires to end slavery and so on and so on. Also, you still have the conversation of World War II, which is not usually brought into it. But Neil Ferguson, I think, makes his argument, his book Empire. There's lots of love hate about that book. But he does make the point that England sacrificed its own empire. So the Hitler Empire, Japanese Empire, Mussolini's Empire, who are, by any discussion, far worse, couldn't take over the world. In some ways, that kind of sacrifice is kind of well worth it. And the fact that we tend to not realize that happened as well, to think that there's no cost involved with that was a big cost that essentially the loan from the UK got from the US didn't get paid back until 2023 or 2026. So that cost was immense. So the idea that Britain didn't try to do anything to kind of heal itself from its bad ways is not true.
It's interesting. No, it's really interesting what you're saying. I mean, what do you say to those? I'm just thinking of like what someone that I would say the overwhelming majority of people that would listen to Equiano podcasts, are very skeptical of these arguments. But someone that, if there was someone that is obviously in favour of, what would you say to those who might say, well, like making it, the arguments that you're making almost remove the moral judgment against Britain. Like when you were saying, well, if you take some of those Caribbean or British overseas territories, some of them are actually doing better, and they have a level of colonial administration, you might say. So what, and therefore it's essentially arguing away the immorality of colonial rule by making those kinds of arguments.
You see, the problem is that there's a lot of different things are wrapped up in this concept of morality arguments. Because no one is going to argue, or at least I'm not going to argue, that slavery was justified and good. I think no one's trying to make an argument. I'm certainly not doing an argument. But it ended, and it was ended in the UK. So the compensation for morality is tricky because you have to have some kind of damage and calculate other things and so on and so on. If it is a purely moral argument, then yeah, I agree. Slavery is bad. That's true. But the question isn't about morality, it's about cost and compensations or economic arguments. So they try to somehow conflate the two things, but they're not conflatable because the compensation has to be calculated by some metric based on some premise, based on some fact of history. So I don't actually think they're similar.
And just before we move on to what should be done,
Mhm.
there are a few things that I read when I read about this discussion. People say that, for example, some former colonial powers, Britain and France, only very recently finished paying compensation to the people that were the former slave owners. I
Mhm.
don't know, I think that happened in Haiti with France and so on. And so that's one of the things that I said. So in some ways, actually, they were compensating the slave owners that were essentially had to give up their slaves and things like that. So what do you say to that? That essentially Britain and France and other countries, in other ways, have been already, and also, for example, we've had the monarch and some former prime ministers in the UK apologize for slavery, apologize for various different historical wrongs and so on, and they're all already paving the way to accepting their culpability, even if many of those people that have apologized years later had nothing to do with that at the time. So what do you say to those 2 points?
There's lots of things in there. Let me start with the last point. Let me go back to the beginning. So the point you made about some conversation about the UK government only recently paying off debt that they paid to the original slave owners. Yes, that's a popular trope. That's not true. So there's one. I guess one of the important figures that are sorry people that wrote about that was a guy named Chris Manjapra. Mm, I'm not sure if I pronounced his name correctly. He's a professor, I believe, in the U.S. And he actually wrote some books about British Empire, also pro reparations advocate, and so on. The problem is that it doesn't really the people who make the argument don't seem to understand how debt works in the country. And even for me to explain now would take a lot of time, but give a short version of it is when a country borrows money 300 years ago, or no, say 1833, I believe, that debt is usually always like pulled and pushed and recompiled and repackaged and redished and rejiggered and switched around. And the treasury actually, when someone did a freedom request information from the HM treasury about this point, and treasury has like, we have no idea where the original loan gilts went or gone, so you can't possibly come to that conclusion because we have no idea where it came from. So it's just not true. Like when you issue a loan in 1833, or when you borrow money, because the government UK borrowed a lot of money from private lenders at the time, it's essentially on a government gilt or a bond. And you borrow money and you kind of reissue that debt and reissue that money. The essentially all of the debt is one debt. So when you say this particular bond from 1927 was paid off in 2015, that actually tells you nothing about what the original debt was for or where it was used for and so on and so on. So it's just a matter of people getting economics getting conflated with so many other things. It's a nonsensical argument. However, the other factor is actually I'm kind of forgetting what the second part of your question was. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you
Okay.
remember?
So yeah, I remember. Now I will find it very is ironic the correct word? I don't know. But I will find it very ironic if Prime Minister Sunak got on a podium and apologized for British slavery. I'm not sure how many people realize the deep irony in that statement, but that to me shows the point. Like the idea that the current UK government should apologize for slavery is ridiculous. Now, what would happen if they apologize for slavery? Again, I think it's ridiculous, but I don't actually think it means anything at all because the prospects of abolition and emancipation they worked out, right?
Mm.
People have their independence, they can make their own laws, they can make their own choices in the world, and those are the hard stakes of it. If you so now is the other part of the argument. If Caribbean countries decided, and that's what happened, to not actually set good policy, not have good fiscal development, you can't blame the UK for that.
Mm.
It's a easy thing to do, and I guess some kind of fun in some ways, but you really have to figure out how could you do it. So again, in the reparations argument books, like for example, Harry Beckles in his book called How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean, which is essentially a hark back to Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That's we got the structure of the argument from. You realize that they actually have nothing to say, so they say a lot of weird things.
Mm.
So, for example, in the book, he made the point that the debt to GDP of the Caribbean in general is quite high, like over 100%. And he makes that point and says, therefore, Caribbean can't be expected to do good fiscal policies and all the things that someone like me would say they should do. Because the debt is so high, because it was incapacitated from the beginning from colonial period. Essentially, it was a stillbirth. Problem is very easy there, is that the high debt GDP happened in the last 20 years. Because before this, it was actually quite better. So you're saying the last 20 years, that is where it kicked in, that the colonial period was really bad and UK is really bad and UK therefore owes the Caribbean. That's a weird argument to make. Going further, if you also, for example, I mentioned he has this Walter Rodney framework. When you read, for example, and people don't read Walter Rodney's book at all. They know it in some ways, they know of it for sure. Literally the first page he quotes Che Guevara saying that no matter the sacrifice, the capitalist world has to end. And he goes on to discuss, for example, what it means to be development. And essentially saying is that the problems are the imperial powers, they have to end to get out the capitalist structure, so on and so on. That's what he wrote about. So it's not surprising that they don't have any solutions to actual growth and actual progress. Their only argument is to say we need money from the UK or from France or so on and so on. That's the only argument they can make when they lock themselves in that kind of framework.
And so, just one more on that point. Why have these arguments persisted? Because why wouldn't a political leader want to economically transform their own society and you exercise their agency and self-determination without kind of going round with a begging bowl to other countries? What do they gain from perpetuating this argument? Does it give them popularity within the Caribbean electorate? Are there just not enough mainstream voices that say anything differently? What is that kind of political context which makes it more likely that these are the dominant arguments?
So, in some ways, that's like asking why do some countries go communist, even though it doesn't work? Because ideology. That's the basic answer. Now, in the Caribbean, it's tricky because Caribbean hasn't really been seen, I guess recently, as a ideologically divergent region compared to the UK or Western Europe or America. But Oftentimes people just don't know history that much. That's really the underlying cause. And so back in the 50s and 60s, when the colonial period was ending and the independence period was starting, it was actually not a assured bet which way the Caribbean is going to go. So remember, Cuba's in the Caribbean. We know how Cuba went, and they had a very big influence across the region. Guyana, for a long time, was expected to also go the Cuba route. Um, if you read like contemporaneous CIA documents or whatever, it's the same kind of thing. I mean, you don't have to read those kind of things, but the actual person in time, Jagan, was very pro Marxist. I think after that, Burnham, also in Guyana, was very pro North Korea, where it even had people from Guyana going to North Korea, North Koreans coming there, and so on. You had an entire communist uprising in Grenada that the U.S. had to invade, essentially take out the communists and set back democracy. So it was not assured which way the Caribbean was going to go, honestly speaking. And given there's actually so much influence of communism and socialism in the Caribbean, the institutions of education, primarily the um, West Indies University, is very skewed towards that kind of intellectual thinking. So if you read most things published by intellectuals at that in those, because there's more than one campus, but take as one place of that institution, you realize that they're pretty much Marxists and socialists. That's all they think about. So it shouldn't be surprising then, in some ways, what the politics turns out to be. And in many ways, the political class in the Caribbean is not particularly that sophisticated in many aspects. Some of them as politicians are very, very good, but as like statesmen, they're not that good. So when things combine, you see there's no real outside force pushing in a more, let's say, progressive economic direction. It's very socialist leaning, historically, politically, economically, intellectually speaking. So those things combine. It's a very tricky situation to get yourself out of that mentality. And I mentioned the university, the head of the West Indies University, and I should just ask for clarity. Before the Caribbean was the term we use, it was called the West Indies. So some institutions still have that name. So the head of the university is Hilary Beckles, the same person I mentioned who wrote essentially the most important books on this topic, and is cited by anyone who writes about reparations. He is the leader of the university. So it should not be surprising then what is, in some ways, the policies of the school are. And then also the textbooks you use in secondary school in the Caribbean, the two main ones are also written by Hilary Beckles for history. So you can see how everything kind of compounds and compounds and compounds.
And just finally, two questions. What should be done then? Because I guess, and I think when we met in person with Manira, like this is a similar thing that I was saying, that there are people always feel like this, we need to do something. And if we don't need to do anything, what do you think Caribbean countries need to do? And then from a perspective of a British organization, how should our approach be? What should we say if we have a Caribbean leader demanding reparations?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what what should we say in response? So
Okay, so when you say what should we do initially, you mean we as in British people?
no, in the Caribbean.
Okay.
Hmm.
So in the Caribbean, unfortunately, or I guess we say fortunately, I guess some people say unfortunately. I say fortunately, there is a very clear answer, and that is good economic management. Of course, easier said than done. But that's why I think organizations like mine are trying to put the ideas out there that you actually need progress, prosperity, economic growth, and good management. About fiscal management, good monetary policy, good capacity building in institutions of the government, those kind of things are the things you need to do to get yourself to a point where you're where your population is thriving.
Mm.
You don't do that from getting money from UK or France or whatever. And even then, money just not enough. There's not enough money you can give someone to somehow become prosperous. That's kind of goes against what prosperity actually even means. Now, in the UK, on the UK front, there is a problem because even when I speak to people in the UK often, they, on a default basis, the average person, in my view, seems reasonable that reparations is justifiable. They might not say yes, we should do it, or so on, but they would not equally say quickly we should not do it. That's the problem, because in my view, that opens the conversation into actually going towards being influenced by Caribbean people who come and say, hey, you guys should give us money. Now, because, of course, of the leftward tilt of political conversation in the UK, of course, that I think is a greater risk as well, because those things tend to go hand in hand. I don't think they should, but for whatever reason, that's how it's shaken out, and those things go hand in hand. So when, for example, the Prime Minister of Barbados gets invited to the LSE to give a speech about inequality, but actually talk about reparations, and it first applauded by the entire auditorium, that's something you should be skeptical about. Mm. Or when, for example, the Prime Minister, this is true, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent wrote a book about why is a collection of 4 essays, why reparations is important. These are important figures in Caribbean politics. And there is often little or no pushback from people in the UK. And oftentimes I find that it seems to be the reason why there's no pushback is, again, this almost like cancel culture where it's saying, oh, I am not allowed to push back against these people because that will look as some kind of talking down in some way. I think that's the mentality many people have. Also, this is obviously a bigger issue, but it's still an issue. People in the UK have a very poor understanding of UK history. And I mean, that's true in the Caribbean too, to be clear. People in the Caribbean have very poor UK and Caribbean understandings. But in the UK, it's tricky because then when it comes to people from outside the UK, people inside the UK saying facts or supposed facts about UK history, people can't easily make a decision if it's right or wrong because they have no context. So if you have no context for your own history, someone telling your history is bad is easy to consume. That's a problem as well. So those kind of things are actually quite impactful. I also know that people kind of argue for example, let's not do reparations, let's do foreign aid. That's the general phrase people use. I think that's also actually a bad idea. Foreign aid is not useful in this context, nor, and more importantly, it's not necessary. And that's a whole conversation in itself. But I think that's also, that sleight of hand is also, to me, not important either. You should kind of get rid of that as well.
Well, Rasheed Griffith, thank you so much for talking to me. It's funny that you ended on foreign aid, because actually, maybe that is part 2 of this conversation, because that is a whole nother kettle of fish that, I think that we'd really like to get into. Thank you so much for joining me. Everybody, check out the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute. It is doing great work, going to be doing great work, and it's something that we very much support here at the Equiano project, so please check it out and support that fantastic work. Thank you so much for coming on.
Sure, thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy our videos, why not leave a like and hit the subscribe and notification bell so you make sure that you do not miss an episode.